Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a landscape where the snow crunches so softly under your boots that it almost feels rude to disturb it. You stand at the edge of a wind-swept steppe, breath fogging in the cold air, while the last lilac streaks of sunset fade behind you. A solitary figure waits near a battered leather case, hunched over a charcoal smudged parchment. It's a Mongol mapmaker, traveling alone at dusk, sketching a coastline that looks deceptively simple, except for the fact that you can already tell he's leaving something out. And honestly, if you were relying on this map to survive the night out here, you probably wouldn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch beside the cartographer just as he drags a final line along the parchment. His hands, wrapped in layers of wool and leather, tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the intense precision of someone who has spent a lifetime pretending to record everything while actually recording only what he's allowed to. Mongol mapmakers were famous for their skill. They could cross half a continent with little more than an astrolabe, a good memory, and a questionable sense of direction. Historians still argue whether their most secret maps were intentionally coded or simply lost in translation across so many dialects. But this map, this one, has something very intentionally missing. When he notices you watching, he gives a tired half-smile, the sort someone gives when they know you've already figured out the secret, but hope you'll politely pretend you haven't. He taps a blank patch of parchment just north of a river curve. At first, you think it's simply unfinished, but then you see them, faint, almost invisible etch marks in the leather backing beneath the paper. These aren't coastlines or settlements. They're directional indicators, tiny notches pointing towards something far inland, deep into the Siberian forests, where even the bravest caravans hesitated to wander. A few minutes later, a small caravan arrives, bells on the camels' harnesses jingling dully. One of the traders, wrapped in a fur cloak that looks warm enough to qualify as emotional support, leans in and whispers a rumor. According to him, the notches mark the locations of sky watchers, lonely stations where quiet observers spent entire winters tracking auroras as if they were migrating herds. It sounds absurd at first, but then again, ancient peoples measured stranger things. Remember the Egyptians and their crocodile dung sunscreen? Exactly. He tells you the watchers built wooden towers tall enough to rise above the tree line, aligning them with winter stars that skim the horizon. Their purpose is debated even today. Some say they recorded seasonal aurora patterns. Some insist they charted celestial events tied to spiritual rites. Historians still argue whether the watchers were astronomers, shamans, or just extremely bored people looking for excuses to avoid household chores. The mapmaker closes the parchment with a soft thud. He mutters that the observatories were once marked clearly on old maps, but not anymore. Knowledge like that was too precious, too easily exploited. Safer to let the world think Siberia was nothing but endless frost and a couple of friendly bears who would absolutely not hesitate to eat you. As the night deepens, the wind picks up a low, steady hum, as if encouraging you to follow the faint notches across the blank white wilderness. And though you know the cold might claim your toes before the stars reveal their secrets, you rise anyway. Curiosity has that effect. It makes even the iciest paths feel warm enough to walk.
You set out before dawn, trudging into a forest where the trees stand so straight and tall they look like pillars holding up the pale morning sky. The cold here is the kind that doesn't just nip your fingers, it fills your coat, your sleeves, your soul, and probably your browser history. But you keep going, following the faint directional notches the mapmaker hinted toward. The forest is quiet, almost reverent, as if it remembers something you don't yet know. Eventually, you reach what first appears to be nothing more than a clearing, but as you step into it, your boots sink into a depression shaped like an enormous, perfect circle. Snow hides the edges, but you brush some aside and uncover blackened earth, soot, layered, thick, and strangely uniform. Someone, long ago, maintained a fire here for weeks at a time, maybe months. Historians still argue whether these soot circles were heating pits for astronomical instruments or ceremonial hearths for winter rites. Either way, the idea of scientists or monks or whoever they were standing out here for months makes you question every time you've complained about your Wi-Fi being slow. You lift your gaze and notice something odd about the trees. Many of them lean at identical angles, as if shaped by winds that don't exist anymore. And then you realize they're aligned. Row after row of trunks stretching toward the horizon, perfectly matching the winter star paths that skim the northern sky. This wasn't a forest chosen at random. This was an observatory built out of nature itself, a place where watchers read constellations the way travelers read road signs. As you walk deeper, you find remnants of wooden posts emerging from the snow like ancient ribs. Their tops are carved, smoothed by weather and time, but they still point in deliberate directions. One aims toward where the sun rises during solstice. Another points toward the region of sky where the aurora arcs most brightly in January. And there, near the center, lies a post unlike the others, shorter, thicker, with grooves cut into its surface. You run your glove across it and feel the faint pattern of tally marks. Months, maybe, or observations, or just a frustrated astronomer counting how long he had to wait before going home. You warm your hands near the soot pit, imagining the watchers huddled around fires, their fur cloaks stiff with frost. You picture them lifting primitive instruments toward the sky, bone shadow markers for measuring the angles of stars, strings coated in animal fat so they wouldn't freeze, and the strangest tool of all, frozen water lenses. Yes, actual ice lenses. People in the far north sometimes used blocks of clear lake ice as magnifiers. You try not to think about how quickly they must have melted if someone breathed too hard. A guide accompanying your trek shrugs when you ask what these stations really were. He says, some say scientists, some say shamans, some say they were just extremely committed sky fans. Another guide scoffs, insisting these were the earliest Siberian timekeepers, tracking the relationship between auroras and seasonal migrations. Historians still argue whether such theories are brilliant insights or just the scholarly equivalent of cosmic fan fiction. You sit on a fallen log, letting the quiet sink in. The soot circle, the aligned trees, the carved posts, they don't shout their story. They whisper it, gently, like someone telling you a secret they're not sure you'll believe. And the deeper you listen, the more you feel that this forest wasn't just an observatory, it was a classroom, a sanctuary, maybe even a refuge for minds trying to understand the sky when the world around them was mostly unknown. As the wind carries fine snow across the clearing like drifting silver threads, you rise again. The forest is not done with you yet, and neither are the secrets hiding beneath its frost.
You leave the forest behind, with its leaning trees and soot-marked secrets, stepping onto a stretch of snow so untouched it feels like walking across blank parchment. The air sharpens, colder than before, as if the land is warning you that the deeper truths hide where the cold is bold enough to bite. You follow a subtle depression in the snow, an old path no wider than a cart track. It winds across frozen ridges, dips into valleys, and then rises again, always pointing north. Your guide calls it the Meridian Road, though he admits no one truly knows what the ancient watchers called it. Historians still argue whether it was meant for caravans, messengers, or astronomers making their slow pilgrimage from station to station. There's a rhythm to the walk, a kind of quiet heartbeat in the landscape. Your boots find the narrow trail even when you're not looking at it, as though the path remembers being traveled and is gently pulling you along. Every so often, you spot faint markers, flat stones poking above the snow, birch branches tied in old knots, and once, astonishingly, a shard of bone sticking upright like a frozen sundial. The shape of its shadow tells you the sun is still climbing. It also tells you this wasn't just a road. It was a timeline, a moving instrument that helped ancient skywatchers keep their bearings, even on days when the horizon blurred into an ocean of white. As you trudge along, the wind shifts, and you hear something faint, wood tapping against wood. When you crest the small ridge, you see them, half-buried wooden crates scattered like forgotten luggage. You pry open one, and inside you find a collection of tools that make you pause. The first is a tiny bone caliper, the type used to measure distances between stars when sketched on hide or bark. The second is a shallow bowl that your guide identifies as an ice mold, basically a container for shaping clear lake ice into makeshift lenses. It's a ridiculous idea until you hold it up and see the faint distortion of your own glove through the unmelted shards still stuck inside. Apparently, ancient scientists were the kind of people who looked at freezing temperatures and thought, yes, perfect conditions for experimental optics. The last tool you find is stranger still, a flat wooden plate carved with parallel grooves. You run your thumb across them, counting. 12 grooves, then a gap, then 10 more. Historians still argue whether these boards recorded lunar cycles, aurora intensities, or were simply early checklist systems reminding the watchers not to forget their food rations. A traveling scholar once joked that ancient astronomers were basically the first people to invent the to-do list. Judging by the detail on this board, he might not have been far off. As you continue down the Meridian Road, a soft glow brightens the sky, even though the sun is still low. It isn't sunlight. It's the faint shimmer of the midday aurora, a rare phenomenon in these latitudes, but not impossible. You stop, breath-catching, as green light brushes the sky like watercolor strokes. Your guide murmurs that travelers used to interpret it as a celestial sign, confirming they were still following the correct path. Historians still debate whether this is poetic metaphor or literal navigation technique. But as you watch the flickering curtain of color, you understand why ancient watchers trusted it. The aurora feels like a giant compass needle pointing the way. By late afternoon, you reach a small rise overlooking a valley. Here, the Meridian Road splits into several smaller trails, each fading into the distance like strands of silk laid gently across the snow. Your guide kneels and traces them with a gloved hand. He says, "Stations," quietly. 3 in that direction, 2 more beyond the ridge, and 1. He points toward a shadowed forest line, the one they were most protective of. It's becoming obvious now this wasn't a random scattering of observatories. It was a network, interconnected, coordinated, deliberate. Yet, scholars still dispute whether this proves a true scientific system or just a coincidence of similar practices spread across nomadic groups. Some academics politely ignore the evidence altogether, calling it interpretive overreach, which is academic language for "we don't want to rewrite our textbooks." But as you stand on the ridge watching the trails vanish beneath sheets of drifting snow, you feel the weight of the hidden design. These watchers weren't isolated. They were linked by sky, by path, by a purpose no one fully remembers. And the mapmaker's missing symbols suddenly make sense. Some knowledge wasn't erased. It was simply protected, waiting for someone patient enough and cold enough to rediscover it. You pull your coat tighter as the temperature drops again, following the trail toward the observatory the watchers guarded most fiercely. The sun is sinking, but you're not turning back now. Not when the sky itself seems to be guiding you forward.
The slope levels out, and before you stretches a clearing that feels almost ceremonial. Snow crunches beneath your boots, muffled by a sudden calm in the wind, and the surrounding trees lean in slightly, as if to peer over your shoulder. In the center lies the main observatory, a circular arrangement of stones half buried in snow, each carved with grooves and faint symbols. You notice the precision, the spacing, the angles, suggesting careful observation, not random construction. Historians still argue whether these layouts were intended purely for measuring celestial events or if they had ritual significance as well. Stepping closer, you find a small wooden platform, its boards warped by age but still surprisingly intact. On it rests a collection of instruments, an astrolabe-like device, a series of etched bone sticks, and a surprisingly delicate compass made from lodestone. The guide whispers that these tools may have been borrowed ideas from far-off civilizations, hinting at trade routes you'd never expect this far north. You can almost see the Mongol caravans trudging through tundra and steppe, delivering not only goods but knowledge. Quirky as it seems, the combination of crude ice lenses and polished lodestones allowed the watchers to track not just the stars, but also patterns in aurora intensity, a phenomenon most Europeans wouldn't systematically record until centuries later. You run your gloved fingers over the carved grooves in one of the stones, feeling the rhythm of numbers and markings. 12 major grooves, 12 minor, like a celestial clock. Here, the watchers calculated lunar cycles, predicted solar events, and likely noted shifting auroras. A faint echo of laughter drifts through the trees. Your guide says it's just the wind, but you imagine the ancient observers chuckling at the thought of their painstaking measurements confusing future generations. Historians still argue whether this layout was intended purely for measuring celestial events or if it had ritual significance as well. The cold presses against your cheeks, but you linger, compelled by the quiet geometry of the stones. Beyond the observatory, low mounds mark sleeping quarters for travelers and apprentices. The wooden frames have mostly collapsed, leaving skeletal remnants, but you can see evidence of careful planning. Fire pits, small storage trenches, and even a shallow trench system for water runoff. The watchers were practical, not just contemplative. Their lives demanded both calculation and survival skill, a duality that is hard to convey from a distance of 700 years. As dusk settles, you notice a faint shimmer across the valley, a reflection of ice, snow, and sky. A curious contraption lies nearby, a frame holding translucent ice panes angled perfectly toward the remaining sunlight. Your guide murmurs that some scholars believe this was an early form of a sundial, augmented with ice lenses to magnify and record solar arcs. You tilt your head, imagining a pale sun refracting through frozen sheets onto a carved slate. It's absurdly elegant, and it suggests a mind not only concerned with observation, but with beauty and precision. Historians still argue whether these were standardized scientific instruments or local improvisations that only coincidentally resemble devices elsewhere. Night approaches, and as the last light fades, the aurora bursts again, brighter, green and violet dancing in slow waves above the observatory. You feel a strange kinship with those who once sat here, measuring the sky and whispering to each other about cosmic alignments and winter constellations. You realize the map's omissions were intentional. Some knowledge was meant to be encountered in person, slowly, with patience and quiet attention. This hidden observatory was a living map, a lesson in resilience, ingenuity, and perhaps the gentlest kind of secrecy.
You trudge past the observatory, your boots leaving a crisp rhythm in the snow, and notice a faint trail leading up a gentle incline. The wind has softened, carrying only the distant, muted howl of some Arctic predator and the occasional crack of ice shifting under its own weight. Here, the smaller satellite stations of the Mongol sky network are scattered like constellations on the land itself. Each one is marked by a single upright stone, inscribed with a barely legible symbol, some resembling stars, others resembling animals, and a few that look like letters from a script you don't recognize. Historians still debate whether these markers encoded practical astronomical data or were symbolic, ceremonial, or even mnemonic devices for teaching apprentices. Stepping closer to one of the stones, you notice a hollow depression filled with frozen rainwater, reflecting the dim twilight. According to your guide, it was used to calibrate the angles of the main observatory during full moons, doubling as a simple yet effective level. Quirky as it seems, some locals also claimed that droplets from this pool could foretell the weather if observed carefully over several nights. You smile at the thought of an ancient forecasting pool in Siberia, so far removed from the luxury of European weather instruments. Continuing along the trail, you come across remnants of long wooden frames, perhaps shelters or temporary workshops, half sunk into snow and ice. The Mongol scholars who used these observatories were as much engineers as stargazers. The placement of each station demonstrates a mathematical understanding of latitude, sight lines, and horizon angles, subtly suggesting that these structures were intended to form a coherent observational network, possibly spanning hundreds of kilometers. Historians still argue whether these were truly coordinated or merely a series of independent installations that coincidentally align with celestial patterns. A small wind whistles sings through a gap in the stones, and you pause, noticing that some grooves seem designed to channel sound. Perhaps it was used to communicate across distances in the bitter cold. You imagine a system of signals, low whistles echoing through valleys, connecting the observers like a sleepy Arctic Morse code. The more you look, the more it becomes clear that this was more than an observatory. It was a living network, a brain stretched across the frozen wilderness, quietly recording the heavens while hiding in plain sight. Night deepens, and you finally settle behind a low mound to watch the aurora ripple above the main station. The lights cast subtle green shadows across the stones, and you think about the centuries these observatories have kept their secrets. The Mongols, you realize, were careful archivists of the sky, and their omission from maps wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. The observatories were intentionally concealed, knowledge only to be discovered by the patient, the observant, and the curious. You imagine countless travelers over generations wandering these frozen valleys, perhaps sensing the power of the network without fully comprehending it. It's soothing and humbling, knowing that some secrets remain, quietly guiding the skies above us.